Everyone knows Goliath. At 30 years old and 43 feet long, it's recognized as the world's oldest and largest Tyrannosaurus Rex. But there's something you don't know. A paper published in January 2026 revealed a new contender that dethroned Goliath, Big Bertha. According to this study, T.Rex could be 70% larger than current fossils suggest. This is mind-blowing. Every year, a new colossal Tyrannosaurus Rex specimen seems to emerge from excavations, each one taking the throne. First Sue, then Scotty, Goliath, Cope, the list goes on and on. I know you're tired of hearing the same old thing and want something new, which is why I'm proud to tell you right away that this paper did much more than just reveal Bertha's impressive body size. This paper also revealed that T-Rex's growth rate was much slower than previously estimated, and that this tyrant king could have lived significantly longer than past research indicated. One of the most fascinating aspects of Tyrannosaurus biology is how this animal grew from a small hatchling into a massive adult. And for a long time, we thought we understood how that happened, but we were wrong. Because this research turns our previous understanding of T-Rex growth upside down. It also yields interesting and unexpected results regarding T-Rex's relationship with the dwarf tyrannosaur Nanotyrannus. Now let's rewind a bit. Back in 2010, a research project was launched at the University of Alberta, aiming to compare the sizes of known T-Rex fossils. The goal was to put a definitive end to the question, which T-Rex is the biggest? As the research continued, findings published in 2019 announced that Scotty's thigh and hip bones were quite large, surpassing Sue, previously known as the largest Tyrannosaurus Rex. However, a few years later, in 2024, a huge rumor exploded. It was revealed that a T-Rex specimen had been sitting in storage for years. Unfortunately, this specimen wasn't as lucky as Scotty. This one had been waiting since 1987. That's 37 years. Despite this, no significant explanation was given about this specimen, and as if it hadn't waited long enough, it was left to wait for another 2 years. As this specimen maintained its mystery, crazy T-Rex enthusiasts eagerly awaited even the smallest crumb of information until 2026. In January 2026, the long-awaited paper was finally published. The findings were so important, so paradigm-shifting, that paleontologists were forced to completely reinterpret everything they thought they knew about how the tyrant lizard king lived, grew, and aged. But before we dive into what makes Bertha so extraordinary, we need to understand the scientific methods behind the discovery. That's partly what makes this find so interesting. The study was led by paleontologist Dr. Holly Woodward, who specializes in a field called histology. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, don't worry. Histology is essentially the study of the internal structure of tissues, particularly bones. In paleontology, when examining fossilized remains, we call this paleohistology. And what paleohistologists do is truly remarkable. They take thin sections from fossilized bones, slice them incredibly thin, almost translucent, and examine them under a microscope to reveal growth patterns completely invisible from the outside. Think of it like examining tree rings, but infinitely more complex. Because unlike trees, which generally produce one ring per year in predictable patterns, dinosaur bones contain multiple types of growth markers that can tell us not just about age, but about periods of rapid growth, times of stress or injury, seasonal changes, and even when an animal reached full skeletal maturity. The fundamental markers paleontologists look for are called lines of arrested growth, or lag for short. These are dark lines, visible in bone cross-sections, that represent periods when growth essentially stopped or slowed significantly. The current understanding is that these LAGs represent annual cessations of growth, likely associated with seasonal changes in resource availability. When food becomes scarce, growth pauses. When abundance returns, growth resumes. Therefore, each lag, much like a tree ring, roughly represents 1 year of life. But here's where things get really interesting. Because this is truly complex. When an animal reaches full skeletal maturity, the point where meaningful growth ends, something distinct happens in the bone structure. Multiple lags cluster very close together, forming what's called an external fundamental system, or EFS. If a dinosaur, particularly in major weight-bearing bones like the femur or tibia, has a clearly defined EFS, paleontologists can confidently say that animal was fully adult. And this is precisely where Bertha's extraordinariness comes into play. For this study, Dr. Woodward and her team examined bone samples from 15 different Tyrannosaurus rex specimens, ranging from 10-year-old juveniles to adults. What they found was truly fascinating. Instead of the brutally fast, almost exponential growth curve suggested by previous studies, the new data painted a very different picture. It became clear that Tyrannosaurus rex went through a much longer subadult growth period than estimated. And this growth was surprisingly linear and consistent rather than rapid. Now, you might be wondering how this methodology differs from previous histological studies. That's a fair question. In every previous study, paleohistologists interpreted lags, lines of arrested growth, as representing seasonal pauses in growth. However, Woodward's team adopted a completely different approach. Contrary to traditional interpretations, they carefully examined every visible growth mark and counted them as potential year markers. This provided a much more detailed picture of T-Rex's growth throughout its entire lifespan. The data suggested that older T-Rex individuals may have lived into their late 30s. Some specimens even showed evidence of reaching their early 40s. Think about that. We're talking about Tyrannosaurus rex potentially living for 4 decades. That's significantly more than previous estimates, which generally maxed out around 28 to 30 years. Surprised? But there's more. If you've made it this far in the video, you can leave a bone emoji in the comments as a tribute to T-Rex's growth, or you can subscribe to my channel to support me directly. So, what about Bertha? I mean, that's why we're all here, right? To find out just how big this legendary specimen actually was, well, this is where things get really complex. Based on a detailed examination of the tibia or shin bone of the officially cataloged Bertha specimen, researchers determined that this individual had not quite reached full skeletal maturity. The tibia showed clear evidence of just beginning to deposit an EFS. But surprisingly, when they examined the femur or thigh bone, they found something unexpected: no EFS. The femur didn't show clear evidence of complete skeletal maturity. Bertha was very close to being fully grown, certainly in the final stages of reaching maximum size, but hadn't quite crossed that line. The process of appositional growth, adding new layers to the bone's outer surface, was essentially complete in the tibia, but was still ongoing in the femur. Hey guys, I invite you to think about this. You're witnessing something quite interesting right now. Perhaps femurs continue depositing bone material later in life than tibias do. The different bones in the same skeleton might reach full maturity at slightly different times. I know it's too early to make a definitive diagnosis, but this alone is exciting enough. Definitely more research is needed to confirm if this pattern holds true across multiple individuals. Still, we can estimate Bertha's age with reasonable confidence. Based on the clearest, most unambiguous growth marks, Bertha was likely in its late 22nds at the time of death. However, if you count each cortical growth mark as representing 1 year of life, as Woodward's preferred methodology does, that age increases dramatically. Under this interpretation, Bertha could have been in its early 42nds when it died. This would make Bertha not only one of the largest T-Rex specimens ever found, but also potentially one of the oldest. How do you think a T-Rex living for 40 years would have impacted its ecosystem? A creature that survived and thrived for 4 decades in the harsh, competitive ecosystem of late Cretaceous North America. T-Rex is truly becoming an increasingly incredible monster. Now, I know what you're really wondering. Everyone is definitely wondering the same thing. How big was Bertha? What did this dinosaur actually weigh? Let's compare this specimen with famous ones like Sue, Scotty, and Goliath. Paleontologists use several methods to measure theropod body size, but one of the most reliable is femoral circumference. That is the thickness of the thigh bone at its narrowest point. This measurement strongly correlates with body mass because the femur has to support the animal's entire weight. Simply put, a heavier dinosaur needs a thicker femur. Most plausible adult or subadult T.Rex specimens have femoral circumferences in the 500 to 550 millimeters range. To put this in perspective, detailed reconstructions of specimens at the lower end of this range are around 9.2 to 9.4 tons. Scotty, one of the most famous large T.Rex specimens, has a femoral circumference of 570 millimeters. Biomechanically plausible reconstructions place Scotty at approximately 10.5 to 11 metric tons. Then there's Sue. Sue's femoral circumference is estimated at 574 millimeters. If you standardize the methodology, Sue's true circumference could be 10 to 15 millimeters higher, perhaps in the mid-580s. With biomechanically appropriate soft tissue reconstructions, this corresponds to a body mass between 11 and 13 tons, depending on exactly how you model musculature and fat distribution. What about Goliath? Its femoral circumference was calculated as 640 millimeters in 2024. What? No way! Currently, that would make Goliath the largest T.Rex. However, there are problems with this assumption. While Goliath's thigh bone appears to be in generally good condition, there is significant damage at the proximal and distal ends, making it difficult to measure its length. So how can we know if it was really that big? For now, we can't, because Goliath doesn't have material as well preserved as Copes. Remember, no matter how large this thigh bone is, it's just one thigh bone. Scaling from a single bone is never ideal, and maybe this specimen just had oddly large thighs, who knows? And Bertha? When the fossil was first discovered and the femur was initially measured in its crushed, distorted state, the circumference came out to 570 millimeters. This was already a high value for Tyrannosaurus rex, but Dr. Woodward didn't stop there. She meticulously took the thin section sample used for histological analysis and created a detailed digital reconstruction. The results? The reconstructed thin section circumference measured 598 millimeters. But wait, there's more. It was later realized that the thin section was not taken from the thinnest point of the femur. While a definitive answer isn't given yet, we at least know that Bertha's femoral circumference was more than 598 millimeters. This gives us an animal approximately 12.5 meters long, with a range of 11 to 12 tons. A true giant among giants. But what makes Bertha truly important isn't just its size, as impressive as it is. Because Bertha was just barely reaching skeletal maturity, on the cusp of being fully grown, while also being at least in its late 20s, possibly early 40s, this tells us something deeper. For comparison, Sue died after having been skeletally mature for about 8 to 11 years. Sue had finished growing, reached maximum size, and then lived nearly another decade as a fully mature adult. Bertha, on the other hand, may or may not have finished growing. It was right on that border, but it was close to the same age as Sue. Think about what that means. Two Tyrannosaurus rex individuals, both approximately the same age, but one had finished growing years earlier, while the other was still adding bone tissue, still increasing in size. This level of growth plasticity within a single species is certainly remarkable. Now, we need to address the tiny tyrant. Because in recent years, there has been a significant debate about whether a small tyrannosaur, called Nanotyrannus, was actually a separate species or just a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. This debate reached a fever pitch in the paleontology community. A recent study by Zano and colleagues presented convincing evidence that Nanotyrannus was indeed a distinct species, not a juvenile T.Rex. So how does this affect Woodward's growth curve study? Her team analyzed two specimens previously identified as Nanotyrannus, nicknamed Jane and Petey, and they found that these two individuals did not show similar growth rates to confirmed Tyrannosaurus rex specimens. However, Woodward's team was careful not to wade too deeply into the Nanotyrannus debate. Instead, they cautiously noted that these two small tyrannosaurs were likely different species from Tyrannosaurus rex, without making bold claims about the validity of Nanotyrannus as a genus. But here's the important part. Even if you completely remove Jane and Petey from the analysis, the study still included 15 confirmed Tyrannosaurus rex specimens. That's a significant sample size, substantially larger than any previous growth study, and it greatly increases our knowledge of T-Rex maturation and growth rates. The optimal statistical model, which excluded the potential Nanotyrannus specimens, revealed something remarkable. Tyrannosaurus rex remained in its subadult stage for a full 2 decades. 2 full decades of continuous steady growth. And during this extended subadult period, T-Rex added about 360 kilograms of body mass every year. That's nearly 800 pounds per year. Think about the implications of this growth rate. A young T-Rex at 10 years old might weigh around 1,000 kilograms, roughly 1 metric ton. If it survived hunting, disease, and environmental dangers, by the time it reached 20 years old, it could achieve a weight of over 4,500 kilograms. And growth, albeit at progressively slowing rates, would continue into its mid to late 20s and potentially beyond. This growth pattern is actually much more similar to other large theropods, particularly carcharodontosaurs like Mapusaurus and Giganotosaurus, than previous research suggested. For decades, paleontologists believed T-Rex had a unique, incredibly fast growth strategy that set it apart from other megatheropods. However, Woodward's study shows that Tyrannosaurus wasn't that exceptional in this regard. It reached its massive size not through sudden adolescent growth spurts, but through sustained, consistent growth over a long lifespan. The youngest specimen in the study, cataloged as MOR 1,189, was about 10 years old at death. Based on bone microstructure, researchers calculated that its first visible growth line corresponded to a body mass of approximately 26.9 kilograms. This first growth mark was likely deposited when the animal was just 1 or 2 years old. Imagine a T-Rex hatchling, slightly larger than a big dog, already beginning to develop the skeletal structure that would eventually support a multi-ton apex predator. This transition from such a humble beginning to full adult size opens the door to one of the most dramatic transformations in the entire animal kingdom. Now, we must also touch on another recent debate in Tyrannosaurus research. Some paleontologists have proposed splitting all Tyrannosaurus rex specimens from the Hell Creek Formation into 3 separate species. The aim here was to account for size and morphological differences among various specimens. Based on skeletal proportions and femoral robustness, these proposed species were named Tyrannosaurus imperator, Tyrannosaurus rex, and Tyrannosaurus regina. Do you think this species split is really necessary? I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Dr. Woodward and her team sought to answer the question, is T-Rex actually more than one species? By reading the growth stories in the bones. The growth patterns they observed in all the T-Rex specimens they examined suggested these dinosaurs were a single species. The differences among them, much like the variations in height and weight among humans, seem to stem from normal diversity within a single species. So, bone histology can't tell us. Yes, there are definitely 3 separate species, but this doesn't mean a species split can't be made based on other bone characteristics. It just means that growth rings in bones don't provide strong evidence supporting this triple split. However, there's something else very important in Woodward's paper. For years, some researchers have tried to assess dinosaur adulthood based on indicators of sexual maturity. For example, the presence of medullary bone found in female birds during egg production. This seems logical at first. If an animal is sexually mature enough to reproduce, it must be an adult, right? Wrong. At least not necessarily. As Dr. Woodward and her colleagues point out, assessing adulthood based on sexual maturity is nearly impossible for fossil animals. We simply don't have reliable markers for when sexual maturity occurred. Modern reptiles can reach sexual maturity years before they stop growing. A female crocodile can lay eggs while still increasing in size each year. The same could easily be true for dinosaurs. If we consider that the species exhibited sexual dimorphism similar to the American alligator, T-Rex could reach up to 24 metric tons. However, since sexual dimorphism is considered very unlikely, this estimate is not taken too seriously, because otherwise, significantly larger specimens would have already been found. The only reliable way to determine true skeletal adulthood is through histological analysis, looking for that external fundamental system in major limb bones. Examining growth rates through detailed bone microstructure analysis. Anything else is, at best, speculation, and at worst, misleading. As emphatically stated in the paper, I also want to point out that these estimates are based not on actual fossil evidence, but solely on hypothetical modeling, and therefore should be treated as a null hypothesis in the absence of size-limiting constraints. Moreover, the paper only uses T.Rex as an example, because the idea that paleontologists have likely not found the largest specimen of the species applies not only to all dinosaurs, but also to many extinct animals. Perhaps the largest T.Rex is still lying underground. Who knows? Every new discovery fills some gaps, while simultaneously revealing new questions, new gaps in our knowledge. There is always more work to be done, always more specimens to be found and analyzed. Thank you for watching. Let me know you've made it to this point in the video by leaving a dinosaur emoji in the comments. You can also support me by subscribing to my channel. See you next time.